I see a few thumbs
Yes.
up. I think that is, yeah, see there's a positive sign. Yeah. Cool.
Yes.
All right. So I'm very honored to be here with you guys today. It's a fantastic lineup of researchers. So I'm Zach from Aalborg University in Denmark. I'm also affiliated with the Department of Biological Psychology and Neuroergonomics at the Technical University of Berlin. I have a few disclaimers throughout. The first one being that the work I'm going to present now is based on my PhD project that I finished about 3 years ago. And I've only included bits and pieces of the more, let's say, newer, more exciting projects that I'm currently doing. Anyway, so today I will be speaking about the neuroscience of architectural transitions. I guess that for me, all human experience whatsoever is first and foremost temporal. That's why I think of any experience related to architecture as transitions. So for example, before I got into my office space here, I was at the entrance, and before the entrance, I was just outside. And you can basically go on like that. We're always coming from somewhere, we're always going somewhere. So that's why for me, it's always about a transition to understand human experience. We're all just passengers of life through time. And I was wondering at one point, well, what is like the neuroscience behind this very basic feature of human experience, a very basic one, right? Like, how can we understand these conditions and their limitations? So these are like the type of questions that I'm interested in. So I have a few points, 3 points that I hope to touch upon today. Basically, I hope to convince you that human experience is affected by affordances in the environment. That is, by suggesting that architecture is a landscape of action opportunities that are shaping our experience. I'm also going to touch upon the fact that action and temporal structure matters to human experience. I'm going to talk about that through cognitive neuroscience. Then also touch upon a methodology that is called mobile brain body imaging, because it's a promising methodology, I think, for the neuroscience of architecture. And this is basically this latter point, suggesting that mobile neuroscience is unique in discovering some of these unconscious and rhythmic processes. So I should say that I'm an experimentalist. So of course, for me, it's natural. We start off with an experiment. So of course, it's a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that we have to assess the experience of space B, right? And we can approach it from space A, going into space B. And afterwards, we're going to look at the same space, but this time coming from space C into space B. These are 3 distinct spaces, right? Here's the question: can you compare these experiences of the very same space? Does this temporal structure matter? Does it matter whether I go from A to B or C to B? Now, intuitively, we don't think that they're comparable, and usually we think that they're not comparable because human experience is cumulative, right? It's like accumulating over time, and so every moment is going to feel like a renewed one. But even before bringing up this aspect of the cumulative experience, it's already quite clear to us, right, that our experience of the world is of a particular kind. The first great consideration is that life goes on in an environment, not merely in it, but because of it, through interaction with it. Here I'm quoting Dewey, who is one of my heroes, the pragmatist, and basically stating that senses are stimulated in a certain way that give rise to new actions and so on. And that is like the part that I was talking about before, that you're going somewhere. That's the aspect of it, right? It's entirely motoric and it's pregnant with action. Now, this loop between the senses and the action is what I refer to as the sensory motor dynamics. It's a very common concept in cognitive psychology and in cognitive neuroscience. So what's really to learn from this concept? Well, I think that human experience is first and foremost a matter of interaction. And therefore, for me, it's about an embodied phenomenon. And in addition to that, we also collect experiences, right? Like we're using our prior experiences automatically to anticipate the world. So you might wonder now, what does all of this have to do with time? Why is the temporal aspect of human experience important? Well, the analysis of temporality are perhaps the most important in the whole of phenomenology, stated by Edmund Husserl in one of his early works on the phenomenology of consciousness of internal time. So what does that even mean, right? I mean, consider this sentence that I'm saying right now. Even though the very beginning of my sentence has already disappeared from the present, the end has not even arrived yet, and you still have a good grip of where my sentence is going. So as you'll see in my next couple of slides, it's because we are constantly using our prior experiences of the world to generate predictions about the world. This is also what you see in these big LLMs, algorithms, and so-called AI. So just to close this slide, and just like the pragmatist and the phenomenologists, I believe that action and the temporal structure, they make up the very basics of human experience, which then makes it, for me, necessarily an embodied and temporal phenomenon. Now, you might think this is all obvious, isn't it? I mean, you might ask, how is this any different from any other framework? And this brings me to enactivism. So you see, most of neuroscience, some would still argue today, is very dominated by the cognitivistic and static view of cognition and human experience. So what does that mean? The static and this passive perspective suggests that cognition, it includes some kind of, sequential and discrete process. First, you perceive the world, then there's some kind of black box going on, some cognitive process going on, and this is the task of the cognitive neuroscientist to uncover what is going on here. And then there are some decisions to make, and this is reflected and expressed through some kind of action, right? So if we take the pragmatic, or the pragmatists and the phenomenologists' perspective seriously, which essentially means that we take the interaction and the temporality seriously, we basically arrive at the very fundamentals of enactivism. This is the view that the body and the environment shape cognition and perception. This is like a tight link between action, suggesting how our perception and the environment are stimulated by exploring the world. So we dynamically adapt through our ongoing actions, right? And so we are basically co-creating through engagement. And in this sense, I believe that it's fair to say that you can actually flip these arrows. So you can basically flip, yeah, exactly, yeah. So you see here that the cognition part now becomes obsolete in a sense because there is no longer the need for some kind of particular process to resolve a particular task. It's something that is ongoing. It happens as you are doing things. This dynamic aspect is the most important aspect here. So as we are interacting with the world, how does the world sort of invite certain behaviors and actions? Well, it does so by appealing to very specific possibilities of actions. And this is what was coined by James Gibson as affordances. And I like to think of them as the possibilities for action that the world offers, determined by the fit between an organism's physical structure and the environment. So we can basically think of affordances as embodied predictions, in the sense that we predict the bodily actions that are necessary to, for example, climb stairs. So what does all these predictions and sensory motor dynamics have anything to do with the brain? Well, basically, the brain is organized both anatomically and functionally in hierarchies, and it operates using both forward and backwards flow of information. So some of that might sound crazy. How is there like a bi-directional flow of information? Isn't the brain just picking up a lot of sensory information and basically using that to process a lot of things? Well, actually, no. The information is flowing backwards are called predictions, and they are all based on prior experience. And those that are flowing forward are the prediction errors. That means the world that we are perceiving is basically predicted and adjusted according to the prediction errors. Is what we call the error correcting approach to the brain. And this is perhaps the biggest change of perspective in neuroscience. There's the fact that the brain is actually generating these predictions and does that on several scales. So the prediction error basically travels further up the hierarchy if it's noticed, and then it makes it measurable in the brain. So the hierarchical structure that we see in the brain reveals something very important. It reveals that there is a balance of incoming and outgoing signals. This is what I find interesting, especially in how basic and early perceptual processes can affect higher ones. So what's important to note for now is that the brain has several layers interconnected through predictions and prediction errors. So what we measure when we do EEG, when we apply the electroencephalograph, short for, that's what EEG stands for. We're basically measuring prediction errors from the scalp, right? So this is what an EEG looks like, and this is basically the anatomical structure underlying the measures that we are collecting, that we are recording, that we pick up, and basically we have a number of channels. These are called channels. All of these yellow dots. And we are measuring basically synaptic activity. And this is the immediate response from neural communication. And this is the important one, right? So in the context of, prediction errors, the bigger the error, the stronger the response. And it's important to note here that the brain, as far as the literature goes, does not reveal the content of the prediction error. We can just see that there is something that went off. It's a processual step, right? We can see that the process is, the whole system has noticed something was not predicted correctly. But we cannot know of what. The best we can do is guess. And we do our qualified guess based on the experimental setup. So this is just a healthy reminder that we need proper systematic experimental setups if we want to say anything concrete about the brain. So why is this all important to know? Well, affecting the early processes in the hierarchy means affecting everything that is flowing upwards, right? Including the cognitive processes and human experience. The question for me is therefore, can we affect some of these early processes using architecture? And given basically the theory that I just was talking about, in activism, the temporality, and so on, affordances in particular, wouldn't we, expect that these actually play a role? Nobody knew, so we had to make the experiment. And again, I'm coming back to why is the brain of any interest? Well, the sensory and motor neurons all culminate in the brain, and this is exactly what we're talking about. The sensory motor dynamics are exactly what the brain should reflect, but this is what we hypothesize, and so this should be measurable in the brain. And as I said, affordances are embodied predictions, and I asked the simple question, can space alter our embodied predictions? The hypothesis was quite straightforward. We should be able to measure systematic changes over the sensory motor cortex as a function of affordances. So in a study back in 2019 that I conducted with my colleagues in Berlin, we used architectural transitions as a medium. So this is basically the wrapping of this figure here wraps up the whole MOBI, which is short for mobile brain body imaging methodology. Basically what you have is a measure of bodily physiological measures, and you have the EEG set up and combined with virtual reality, and you're completely mobile. Everything is being synchronized through the network, and we basically can look at what's happening in the body as well as in the brain, and we have full control over the visual stimuli. So basically what we had people do was to transition or to move from one space into another one, but we would have everything coded up in virtual reality, and we would ask them to pass through two different kinds of transitions or doors. One door is easily passable. It's 1.5 meters wide. I'm sorry, I don't have the foot. I don't know how many feet this is. Trust me, it's wide. And there is a mid-sized one, which is passable as well. It's also 1 meter wide. And then we had a narrow door, which was only 20 centimeters wide. This is very, very narrow, and it's practically impossible. And so we asked people to try to transition this, to move past this one. And basically, so first the emotional responses, the results, we basically found that people felt significantly less aroused if they could not pass, if they had the narrow condition. We also found that they felt significantly more dominated if they couldn't pass. And we also found that they felt more, let's say, negative if they couldn't pass. So to the EEG results, basically what we find here is that, well, in the experiment, you have people standing, they're basically waiting for a signal that is telling them whether to go or not to go. In this particular duration, I started looking at what happens the moment that you are actually perceiving the door, right? This is the lights on condition. And I looked at over the motor cortex and over the visual cortex, looking at what's happening in the brain. So it's very clear here to see that there are some peaks that are not aligning. And this is because in the narrow condition is significantly different from the two other conditions, showing that the brain is processing that particular perception very differently from the other two transitions. This is over the motor cortex, and this is over the visual cortex. Interestingly, it does not differ between the two passable doors. So what you have here is results that are varying as a function of affordances. So now we move on to the moment where you know which kind of door you're going to pass, and you're waiting for the go or no-go signal. And we see again significant changes over the brain, again over the motor cortex and over the visual cortex. So I was at some point being criticized by my colleagues saying, well, Zach, architecture is not static. Of course, you're moving, you're interacting with it. What's happening during the interaction? And I said, well, let's start looking at these interactions. And I started looking at, well, what's happening in the brain from the moment that you perceive the transition until the moment that you have to basically start walking towards the door. And as you can see here, I'm going to try to explain these plots. Basically, on the x-axis, we have 4 plots. First and foremost, we have 4 plots, and we have on the x-axis the time, and on the y-axis we have the frequencies that you can basically compute from the signals of the EEG. And this plot over here represents the right side of the visual cortex, this one on the left side of the visual cortex, this one over the motor cortex, and this one over motor cortex as well, parietal cortex, sorry. And basically what you see here is that there's like this thick, almost black line passing through here. This is known as the alpha wave. And interestingly, you see quite clearly here, and it's quite unsurprising, again, that the alpha desynchronization, this basically is called a desynchronization. You see it turning dark. It varies as a function of affordances. And so it's known that this alpha, as it's called, between 8 and 12 hertz, it originates from a very deep structure that is called the thalamus. And it does so in a very, very rhythmic way, right? It's a rhythmic suppression mechanism. So the way that we measured it was not directly in the thalamus, but these results, they do imply that we should consider this, predictive principle that is associated and implied in rhythmic activity in the brain. And it's part of our perception and it's part of our experience when we talk about architecture. So the temporal structure of experience, which is here clearly entwined with our movements, is greatly contributing to these predictions. So particularly what I'm saying here is that the whole idea of the brain being a rhythmic organ and your interaction with the world being rhythmic and the whole experience having a temporal aspect, I do think that the rhythm is perhaps the right approach to thinking about the interaction between brain, body, and environment. Again, we wrote a whole paper about this. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I'm basically just going to show here the areas that we found to be active. Basically, what you have is the posterior cingulate cortex, and over the motor cortex, over the parahippocampal regions, and basically the visual cortex. And for those who are interested, because we are taking this aspect of rhythms and architecture to a next level, please feel free to see this new preprint that Efrosini Karlambus and we just put out. All right, so basically what can I conclude from this, from the first study? The whole question that the brain is asking, how can I act, is intrinsically part of what do I perceive? And this is because the sensory signals and the affordances are resolved in parallel. From the second study, we see that even during the interaction, there is a continuous effect by the affordances on the brain and even on subcortical structures, which is known to be extremely important for all other cognitive functions. So this is, again, my conclusion from this would be that architects need to think about the way that we are continuously interacting with the world. And this is why I also allow myself to come up with the conclusion that said perception of the architecture is better understood if we also consider the affordances as we interact with the environment. So affordances are affecting us at the low level and affecting us upwards in the hierarchy, right? And this is basically where my whole interest into rhythms basically was born, because then I started looking into, well, what's actually happening on a rhythmic level between us and the environment. And so I later wrote up a whole paper synchronizing and synthesizing all of these various fields, showing that that you can use a rhythmic input in the periphery, in the visual periphery, to change people's behavior. So, and actually, not only people, even birds, honeybees, and bumblebees. For example, in this one study, they showed that if you change the frequency of the lines on the floor, you can actually make people move faster or slower, depending on the structure of the lines on the floor, depending on the frequency. And even further, they showed that if you increase the cognitive load, the effect increases as well. And so basically, in this particular paper, if you're interested in rhythms and in the environment, we show that we actually analyze a very specific neural mechanism, which I'm showing here, that is rooted deep in the brain, namely the thalamus, right? So basically what we're showing here is that we have to consider the thalamus as a very important subcortical structure for architects, because all sensory information is being pushed through the thalamus up to the neocortex. That means that literally all our sensory information about the world, it needs to pass this place. It's literally the portal to the brain. And there's an increasing interest in neuroscience trying to understand the particular impact of the thalamus on higher structures in the brain. So where my impression is that we're moving towards something that might make sense to us. So the only problem is that this is a very deep structure that you cannot measure directly with the brain. But I do think that we can make very qualified guesses if we use machine learning techniques and causal models. Then we can basically simulate the brain activity that you would expect to find in these areas, including the thalamus, and you can compare those simulated data to the real data. Then you have a better understanding of which regions are transmitting information in what direction. And this is basically the kind of study that I'm running right now, and I'm wrapping up the new results. Obviously, this kind of methodology also has limitations, but I do think that it has an incredible potential if combined with MOBI methodology. So the take-home messages are that affordances is not something that we just consciously lay on top of perception. It is an intrinsic part of perception, and perhaps we should think of affordances as a modulator of human experience. And I think that's an excellent thing, because affordances also offers us a language and a relationship between the psychological and the physiological. So when I say it provides us a language, I literally mean that we can think of the basis of human of experiencing architecture as an active and cumulative and embodied skill through time. Now, I will not reveal too much for now, but I did see Bob Condia in the audience, and I'm going to at least reveal that they have some very exciting results that is showing that the temporal structure of human experience matters much more than we like to think. We can actually modulate the experience. So Elisabetta Canepa is going to present her work at the ANFA September. I highly advise everyone to go see that. Yeah, and of course, I want to emphasize the importance of conducting interactive research, right? So to my knowledge, it's mobile brain-body imaging. It allows to basically time lock movement, brain, environment, everything gets synchronized. I think this is a promising methodology for the neuroscience for architecture. And then I just brought a few questions here that I think might help some researchers and students who wants to enter this field and begin thinking about, well, how exactly should I, approach neuroscience for architecture? Well, my best advice is basically to, identify a specific feature that architects work with, then try to understand how that specific feature is affecting the sensory motor responses and behavior, and then ask the neuroscientific question: how does the effect relate to other networks in the brain, basically? So, of course, much remains unknown. So this is a call for more neuroimaging research in architecture. I hope that we can take a serious move towards empirical research. And as a last thing here, I want to say that architecture is to a large extent designed in time and expectations than in space alone. Thank you for your active attention, of course. I want to thank my collaborators, Situated Mobilities and Sensing Bodies research group of Aalborg University, Carl Friston and Peter Ziegman from the Wellcome Center in Human Neuroimaging, and also Klaus Farman from the Berlin MOBI research group. And yes, as you can see here, I'm starting as a tenure-track assistant professor next week. So of course, stay tuned for new PhD positions and new cool projects. That was it for me.
Well, thanks so much, Zach. And also congratulations, great news. So let's go to Q&A. Again, we have about 8 to 10 minutes, and then after we'll take a short break. So let's start with Fariba, and then after Anne. Go ahead, Fariba.
Zach, thank you so much for this really fascinating presentation. However, I think I need to review this recording 3 or 5 more times to really understand what you were saying. But I do have a question regarding the doors and the individuals facing the doors. My question is, when it said go, no go, was that an indication, a prompt for the person to go, no go, or was that the brain's response after they see the doors?
So that was a prompt, that's a cue, that's we're asking them to not go, or we're asking them to go. Yeah, and also thank you very much for the nice words. And I usually get told by architects that they don't understand what I'm doing, but I never heard the same thing from cognitive neuroscientists. So I'm sitting between 2 chairs, and you know what happens? You fall on your butt. You land on your butt.
Oh, no, that's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. We just need to catch up with the vocabulary. So at the time, the brain is uh, well, we're seeing the door, and the size of the door. I imagine you said, I think you said 0.2 meters, which is about 8 inches. So I'm looking at the door that's really narrow, and I'm thinking in my brain, how do I manipulate this? How do I manage my body to go through this door? Is that part of the brain's activity that you're recording? They're trying to solve the problem solving?
I do have the data, so if you're interested, you can I can share it, and it's already online, so you can look into it if you want. But I did not look into this planning aspect because I was interested in the unconscious, or let's say non-conscious processes that are basically taking part in the early visual processes. So that those processes that has not been contaminated by conscious process, like conscious thought. I want to understand what is happening before that.
So there is an unconscious, uncontaminated, or as I'm looking at a door that's narrow, I'm thinking instantly, how do I get through it? Are you saying there is a lag between those two?
No, I'm saying that there is not a lag, but they are constantly co-informing each other, right? So because your perception is so formed by how you interact with the world, it's already reflected in those processes that you have not been able, you have not had a chance to consciously contaminate them yet. It's already present there. So this really speaks to the importance of movement and action possibilities in the environment. That means that your impression of, let's not talk about the emotional aspect of this. I'm talking about the human experience, the very basics of it. It's already contaminated by motor sensitive information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this is a wonderful discussion. We have several more hands. Let's hope we have time to get through all the questions. And the next one is from Anne. Hi, Anne. You're muted, Anne.
In case someone has more questions, I'm just going to point you to my email here. I'm usually very responsive. I try to be at least.
Yes, good idea. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Anne. We still cannot hear you for some reason. Okay, well let's come back to you, okay? Let's go to Veronica, and I promise I'll get back to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this really inspiring presentation. As far as I got, your experiment is based on a straight line with a clear linear perspectives. And as I got, this is because you have to reduce it to a minimum to measure actually expectation and also what's happening in the brain. But when you say affordances kind of co-create a spatial experience, wouldn't that involve either possibility for a specific action or a decision making involving, for example, motor activity like grasping as a classic human action? So that's actually my question. Like, could you repeat that experiment with a more like demanding affordance environment where you have somebody make a choice to do something or involve surveys, for example, as a base for action-based thinking?
Yeah, I like that question. So I come from a more scientific way of thinking that I want to reduce everything into my research question. And in that reduction, lots of things get lost. It's quite clear. If I had to give them choices, that would increase my design of the study. And that would mean way many more trials, more than I could bear myself to ask from people. Because in this particular trial, there were 3 doors. It's a 1x3 design. They had 240 trials, and it took about 1 hour and 20 minutes just for the experiment. And then there was also equipping things. I could, in theory, and then I would have to pay them a lot. So we need more money to do these kinds of experiments. But the good thing about it, right, is that we can say something very specific. I can say something very specific about the early processes in the brain. And this is why I had to do this kind of experiment. But you're absolutely right. This is an obvious limitation. There is not a choice for them to make per se.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anne, would you like to try again?
Let's see. Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Listen, that was really fantastic, Zach. And I think one of the things that was so important about your talk is you mentioned the thalamus. And I think most architects don't even know about this tube that basically is engaging our body before we're consciously aware of what we're even looking at. And I discovered it by working with iMotions. Have you heard of iMotions, the global purveyor of biometrics? And they have free pamphlets, iMotion spatial expression analysis, which explains, there's a fantastic graphic, which shows that before you visually process something in your visual cortex, because of the way the thalamus works and connects to the amygdala, your heart rate, your sweat glands, your pupil dilation, your body's already responding before you're consciously aware of what you're looking at. And that changes architecture completely.
Yeah.
Get it? It totally is that. And I think that graphic that makes you understand how much your body's responding before you're consciously even aware of what you're looking at is huge. And what's a little scary to me is the car companies know this because they are the major buyers of biometric data in the world. And they study this and know this. The lead designer for Lincoln was recently quoted as saying, the new Lincoln car, he wants you to feel like you're hugged by your mother when you get in. That's the design concept. You know, I don't want to go on here, but I think architects need to know what the car companies already know if we want to build a healthy world. And you're showing the way. And so getting words out like thalamus, which most architects don't even know what that is or why it's significant, is really important. So kudos.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope that, so the thalamus is also known as the neuroscientist graveyard, simply because so many researchers have lost their career to this area. It's unbelievably complex. So it's, yeah, but thanks. I'm looking for Michael Arby because I imagine that he really wants me to, come on, Zach, you can be more precise than,
Michael, is that right? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Anne. Let's go to, we're running out of time for questions. Let's hear from Bijal, who was next. Go ahead.
Hi, that was a great talk. I have a technical question coming from a neuroscience background. You mentioned alpha waves relating to thalamic activity, but generally speaking, when we think of alpha waves, we think of someone in a wakeful, quiet, resting state, and that they transition into a beta rhythm where they're more alert, attentive, thinking actively. Did you see that transition or differences in that transition based on the dimensions of the doorway?
Yeah, that was actually the first question that I started when I had to do the second study where I looked into the duration. I started looking into the frequency domain. That was the first thing I looked for, and no, surprisingly, there was no such a thing. And I guess that I sort of laid it off me because, well, first of all, as you know, the alpha wave is present in almost anything, and it has been in particular associated with wakefulness, but also attention, which, funnily enough, is associated with wakefulness, right? Where when you are wakeful, you're attentive, and that makes sense. There's a relationship there. There should be at least considered. So I never looked into it as a wakefulness aspect of it. Because I could not find any relationships, but for the attention and the relationship with, well, the well-known relationship between suppression mechanisms of the thalamus to the visual cortex, that approach or that route sort of spoke more to me. Now, obviously, this is unfinished business, but after, I guess, 5 years of looking into the data, you just want to move on. You just want to look at something else.
Are you sure this is coming from the thalamus? I mean, theta and alpha waves can come from the cortex, right?
Sure, yeah, there are traveling alpha waves. There are all kinds of alpha waves. Alpha waves can come from many, many places. Am I sure? No, not at all. This is all, I mean, anyone who works with EEG knows that they are not sure. No one is sure, but we can use computational models and we can make qualified guesses. And this is the life of someone who works with the EEG, as compared to someone who is as brave as Fiona working with fMRI.
Okay, thank you. We can take one last question in this session. We'll take it from Maria. And
Hey, Maria.
we do have 15 or 20 minutes set aside at the end of our meeting. So please save other comments and questions, and we should have plenty of time then to cover everything. I also want to ask our presenters, if you don't mind answering questions after the meeting by email, please just type your email in the chat, all three of you. That would be very helpful. And we do invite everyone to continue this discussion. Maria, go ahead, please.
Hi, Tatiana, and hi, Zach.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thanks again, Zach, for a great presentation. I already know your work for some years and had the opportunity of squeezing you extensively last time when we had the conversation. So I'll be brief. I was just curious if you considered in the design of your experiments to include people, neurodiverse people, or also people, for example, with dementia, because, or if you could maybe from what you already learned from your experience, perhaps, you know, share some thoughts or hypotheses of how people who are not using their brain in a sort of neurotypical manner, how they would relate, for example, to this situation that you studied more extensively with the threshold and so on.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Maria. So I have a great colleague, Tenna, Dr. Olsen. I think she's also part of the ACE, and she's
yes.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, and she's very occupied with questions of that kind. And we're starting off. We recently started a new research group, so I imagine that very soon we will be actually doing that kind of experiments. You know, I know that she's working very hard on that type of questions. So, and I have to be careful here, because as an experimentalist, I don't like to speculate so much. One thing I learned from Anja and Chatterjee was like, if you don't know, just do the experiment. And I like that. I like that thinking. So I'm gonna be careful here and basically not speculate too much, because it's difficult for me. I don't know, and it's hard for me to say anything that I don't know. I'm sorry, so I cannot answer that question. I'm so sorry.
No, my question was more.
It's a great question, though.
It was also in a way meant perhaps to trigger your curiosity, because you've dedicated so much time with this research, and it could be also a possibility for you to expand on what you already.
Yes, no, I completely agree. So basically, Tenna, my colleague, she is working with, you know, restraining people's movement, so healthy people, and we are putting some restraints on their joints and their movement to basically look at what happens if your body can no longer really make those movements that you want. So she's the one who's leading that kind of project. So I'm not gonna say too much about it, but I encourage you to ask her that kind of questions. But I agree with you. I want to do more like of that kind of research. I think it's important.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thanks again, Zach. Let's give Zach a big hand.